Hello, it gives me much pleasure to welcome you to the latest in our series of St. John's Pipecasts. And these pipecasts are now no longer simply available on YouTube, but also available as podcasts, again under the name St. John's Pipecasts, and for example now currently uploaded onto Spotify. So those of you who may be prepared to listen to my words, but rather avoid the ordeal of watching me deliver them, I'd encourage you to please check out the podcast channel. Now, our talk today is on the topic of the British Industrial Revolution of the late 1700s as a turning point not simply in British but in human history. Now, our story starts in 1798 when the Reverend Thomas Malthus published a work entitled An Essay on Population. And the story that Malthus told in this book was a simple yet rather sombre one. Malthus' contention was that throughout human history there had been an inherent and recurring tendency for human population growth to outstrip the growth in the food supply. According to Malthus, as population increased, there would be obviously a growing number of mouths to be fed. Now, of course, each human also brings with them the work, the hands to hopefully produce the food and do the work to feed that hunger. The problem was that due to a process that economists now call diminishing returns, as each additional worker is added to relatively fixed amounts of land and soil resources, the amount of extra food produced by each worker would steadily decline, dragging down, of course, the average amount of food per person. This in turn would lead human beings to become increasingly malnourished, prone to disease and sickness, and maybe even famine if harvest failed. And therefore the result, according to Malthus, was a recurring series of demographic crises. So essentially the picture Malthus painted of human population history was one of a period when maybe due to some series of favourable harvests, food supply grew, real income increased, and human population grew as families had larger numbers of children, the parents married earlier, and more children survived into adulthood. The result, of course, is simply more workers and more mouths to feed. This caused downward pressure on food consumption per person, with the inevitable result that every number of decades there'll be some kind of redress of the growing imbalance between population and food supply, and a demographic crisis would bring population right back down again to original levels, and then maybe population would then begin to grow again, and so the cycle repeated itself, with human populations essentially trapped in a cycle of poverty, and any escape from that poverty was short-lived because it simply initiated a growth in population which dragged real incomes back down to basic subsistence levels again. And that was the basic story that Malthus believed had characterised human population history. And there was a great deal to be said for Malthus's ideas when he published them, as I say, in 1798, because if you look at human history indeed, going back many thousands of years, well, by 1800 the total population of the world was about 1 billion. And vast tracts of the world were hardly populated at all. 1 billion was not exactly a large number of humans, compared, for example, today to 8 billion. And humans were not a particularly remarkably successful species, certainly in terms of numbers. And the reason seemed to be that population had always been kept at a low level by the difficulty of securing livelihood from the Earth, from humans living amongst the Earth's surface. It had been hard to sustain a larger population over countless centuries. So Malthus's insights were essentially valid, perceptive, and helped to explain a pretty clear observable fact. The problem for Malthus was his timing of his book, in some sense, could not have been worse, because Malthus's book appeared slap bang in the middle of the British Industrial Revolution, and that Industrial Revolution was to initiate forces and developments that completely exploded Malthus's essential argument and has rendered it for the last 200 years obsolete. Because in the British Industrial Revolution, dating, I say, from about 1760, as the date given by most historians, two things happened. The first was that Britain's population began to increase in historical terms rapidly. And not increased rapidly, but sustainedly. In 1750, England's population was 5.9 million. By 1841, the population increased to 15 million. Taking a slightly wider perspective, Europe's population in 1700 was 127 million. By 1913, it was 500 million. And the world's population, which, as I said, in 1800 was 1 billion, today stands at about 8 billion. So the world had entered a period of sustained and significant, indeed rapid, population increase. Now, of course, population increased before, but Malthus's theory predicted, and indeed history tended to show, that sustained periods of population growth then initiated a process of reaction as humans struggled to sustain themselves and feed themselves with ever larger numbers. And here comes the second point. During this revolution, yes, population increased, but what was unprecedented was that this rising level of population coincided not with falling, but with stable and even rising real incomes per head. In the English case, between 1760 and 1850, real incomes per person in England increased by 58%. In other words, as population grew, people actually got richer. They were better fed, better housed, better clothed. Indeed, humans were actually entering upon an age not of scarcity, but of ever greater abundance. As human society entered into the 19th and 20th century, the problem became not one of too many people chasing too little food, but oddly enough, too much food chasing too few people. And the problem we have today is not scarcity in large parts of the world, the developed world I'm talking about particularly, but obesity. There's simply too much food, leading us to overeat. Now, of course, that's not true of all of the world. Many people still live in poverty and hardship. But this is more a matter of distribution of food rather than supply. The world is bountifully provided for, fortunately for us, with food resources. And this is the remarkable difference that we witness with the prognosis of what Malthus had predicted ever greater scarcity. In fact, we have had ever greater abundance. And that is the dramatic nature of the turning point which began in England in the late 1700s. So what happened here? Well, what happened essentially was a remarkable and sustained increase in the productivity of labour. In medieval times, where productivity of labour was low, each worker would struggle to produce enough each year even to feed their own family, and maybe just a small surplus to supply the church and sustain the ruling elites. As we enter into the 1800s, each worker can produce enough not simply to feed increasingly well a growing population of their own family, but also to feed a great number of merchants, shopkeepers, industrialists, government bureaucrats, artists, doctors, nurses, teachers, retired persons, a whole panoply of people being kept alive increasingly well by a given number of workers. And so the key then is this growth in productivity of labour, meaning that more people can be sustained with the given stock resources. Now, this breakthrough into sustained productivity growth, as I say, began in England and Britain in the late 1700s. And if you look at the British case, two notable developments really stand out. The first, and in some ways the key to the whole process, was a series of developments and breakthroughs in agricultural productivity. Indeed, we often sometimes call this the agricultural revolution. We're talking here about a series of changes in crop rotations, the introduction of new crop varieties, greater inputs of fertilizer and manure, reorganisation of farming systems, the beginning of mechanisation, selective breeding of livestock. The effect of this was to allow British agriculture to exhibit a sustained process of growing output. Taking the 1700s as a whole, agricultural output in Britain grew at about 0.5% per annum. Between 1800 and 1850, it grew at 1.2% per annum. Now, these figures don't sound particularly remarkable. 0.5%, 1.2%, they're not breakthroughs particularly, but they're of absolutely massive importance because this growth in food supply was just about enough to keep pace with the rate of growth of population. And that was the key thing, because it was that meant that population could grow and be fed. It could grow and not be checked by the sinister possibility of famine. Now, famines there were. For example, in Ireland, there was the potato famine of the 1840s, cut population by about 1 million in total. So there was the possibility of famine following on population growth. But fortunately for Britain, that did not happen. Food supply just about kept pace with population. A remarkable result, and one that really broke that Malthusian trap of ever-recurring demographic crises. Alongside this, as part of this, was a growth in labour productivity. Between 1700 and 1850, the productivity of agricultural labour in Britain grew at about 0.3% per annum. This again meant that not only could food supply keep pace with population, but it meant that also Britain could feed its growing population with a steadily contracting share of its labour force engaged in agriculture. As the productivity of agricultural labour increased, then not only could people be fed, but relatively speaking, more and more workers could move out of agriculture into industrial, commercial and transportation uses. So even by 1801, Britain's farming population was only 36% of its labour force. And by 1851, only 22% of British workers were engaged in agriculture, which is a remarkable and unprecedented historical transition. Britain shifted out of agriculture faster almost than any major country in human history. And for the first time, it was the case that most workers were not engaged in the basic task of simply working in agriculture to feed themselves and the population. People could be shifted out of agriculture. And this too was very important because productivity outside of agriculture, in industry and commerce, was higher than that within agriculture. So this gave a further boost and helped to further increase economic output. That's the first part of the story of the British Industrial Revolution, was in fact an agricultural revolution which enabled population to grow whilst avoiding the awful consequence of Malthusian crisis. The second aspect of the Industrial Revolution is, in a way, the more familiar and obvious one, which is the revolution in industry itself. We're talking here about the emergence of the factory system, a far more elaborate division of labour, of mechanisation, and the use of steam power, as well as the revolution in transport, with canals, turnpike trusts, improving roads, and then of course above all, the steam-powered railway. So between 1770 and 1815 in Britain, industrial output grew at about 2.5% per annum. But some industries grew more rapidly than that. Iron grew at 3% per annum, and cotton, which was the fastest growing leading sector in that sense of British industrialisation, was growing at 7% per annum. Now, what caused this breakthrough to modern industrial growth and increasing productivity in the industrial sector? Well, my perspective here is very much shaped by the analysis of Robert Allen in this book, The British Industrial Revolution in Historical Perspective. And there's two things from this book that I want to draw, that Allen draws attention to, that I want to emphasise here today. The first, in the British case, was a shift from wood to coal as the basic power source for driving economic activity. Now, in medieval times, Britain, like most countries, turned to wood as its basic fuel source, which is obvious enough. Wood is ready to hand, lying around in forests. You can easily fell and transport it. Wood was a great fuel source and source of energy. The problem Britain had was it basically began to run out of wood. As deforestation occurred, there was less and less timber to be used. And as wood began to run out of supply, the price of wood increased. Between 1600 and 1800, the price of wood in England trebled. Now, as wood became more expensive and less accessible, there was a search for an alternative power source. Then the British case, and here we do come to, in a way, the good fortune of England, Britain, is that Britain had plentiful supplies of coal. Now, coal is more expensive to initially mine. It's cheaper to gather wood from the surface and dig a coal mine. But as the price of wood increased, it became remunerative to start digging shafts into the ground to extract coal. The paradox was Britain was forced to do this by the shortage of wood. But it turned out that it had thereby been, in a way, served a favour, because coal was a far more efficient and effective power supply source than is wood. By 1800, the cost of power per unit in Britain generated by coal was a third of the cost of the power generated by wood. Coal was a far more effective and efficient power source. And this was most clearly shown in the case of the steam engine, which it's very hard to imagine being generated on sufficient scale with wood power. And the interesting point there, of course, was that the main impetus behind the development of the steam engine was coal mining, because as we started to mine shafts down into the ground to dig coal, mines had a recurrent tendency to flood. And the first steam engines were developed in order to pump water out of the flooding shafts for coal. And of course, because they were located on coal fields, the coal was particularly cheap to use there. So the Newcomen engine was very inefficient as a pioneer engine in the use of coal, but it was able to be remunerative up in the coal fields like of Northumberland. So therefore, Britain began to develop the steam engine. And of course, the steam engine became the archetypal power source during the 19th century, driving forward industrialisation, first in Britain and then around the world. For example, in 1830 in Britain, the amount of steam horsepower generated in Britain was 160,000. By 1870, it was 2 million. So the 19th century was the great age of the steam engine, whose origins date back to the 1700s, and owed a huge amount to the scarcity of wood, which forced Britain into using steam power. Interestingly, other countries also experienced a shortage of wood at this time, the Netherlands particularly, but they didn't have coal to use. So instead they actually turned to peat as an alternative fuel supply. Well, again, it was an alternative fuel supply, but it was not as effective and efficient as coal. So Britain had the benefit of accessing its coal fields. Of course, what was essentially happening here was that whereas the supply of carbon on the surface in the wood form had been exhausted, by mining coal, Britain was essentially accessing vast reserves of fossilised wood, of fossilised carbon. So from one perspective, the Industrial Revolution was really a period in which Britain began to access large quantities of carbon and put them to use in its economy. Of course, in retrospect, this is somewhat now considered not exactly very useful, because we're actually adding to carbon and in the atmosphere and the process of global warming. But this was not appreciated at the time. At the time, what they did appreciate was that coal gave a powerful and efficient source of energy which could be used to transform productivity and living standards within Britain. That's the first of the key developments. The second factor that Allen identifies as important in explaining the British Industrial Revolution was that Britain had relatively high wages. Now, though Britain's population was growing, Britain's population had never grown particularly rapidly or been particularly high. One factor behind this was that in Britain the age of marriage was quite late. Women would often marry, say, in their late 20s. The effect of this was to reduce the overall birth rate in England over many, many decades. Adding to this relatively slow growing population was the fact that with the growth of the Atlantic economy and the port cities of Bristol and London, particularly London, the effect of growing trade and the growth of cities was to drag up wages in England, first in London and rippling out across the economy. So labour in Britain was relatively expensive. And Allen gives a figure. He points out that real wages in London in 1775 were 4 times higher than real wages for a worker in Florence, and 10 times higher than the real wages for a worker in Delhi. What this meant was that it became worthwhile in Britain to expend resources and application to developing machines to substitute capital for labour, because labour was relatively expensive in Britain. This was not true in other countries where labour was relatively plentiful and real wages were relatively low. There it was not worth substituting machinery for labour. So, for example, what you witnessed during this revolution was that entrepreneurs would sometimes think, well, let's take some of these machines across, say, to France and utilise them there, these great new breakthroughs in productive technology. What they found, however, was that they were not remunerative in France, because the plentiful supply of labour meant that cotton, for example, could be spun more cheaply by hand than it could be by machine. But in Britain that was not the case. In Britain, relatively high wages made it remunerative for employers to substitute machines for labour. So in the end, what you have in Britain is a unique combination of two developments. First, the relative growth in the price of wood and the relative cheapness of coal, combined with the relatively high wages. It's a combination of high wages and cheap coal, which is probably the most important single factor that explains why Britain had the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s and other countries did not. So this then was the Industrial Revolution, and this was the nature of the turning point in British and global history. A revolution in agriculture, a revolution in industry, and then a revolution in transportation. Above all, a revolution in productivity. A growth in productivity that enabled first Britain, then Europe, then the world to escape from the clutches of the Malthusian trap, to unlock the door in a way that Malthus had closed on prospect of human prosperity by the recurring problem of ever-growing population and limited resources to satisfy that growing population. The world entered, essentially for another way, into a sustained period of long-run economic growth, that process that Rostow called the take-off into sustained growth. This occurred first, as I say, in England in the late 1700s, then spread into other countries in Europe, into France, Germany, Russia, America. These countries entered the age of sustained economic growth, and this has then spread around the world. And it's this process of sustained growth that has really transformed the way we live and really initiated in the age of modernity, the age of large cities, of mass production of consumer goods, of housing, of food supply, of communications. The whole world was transformed irrevocably as a consequence of this growth process that initiated in the late 1700s. And of course, this process has not been purely benign, because with mass economic growth and industrial processes, there's been obviously the loss of biodiversity, there's been pollution, there's been environmental degradation. So I'm not saying that the Industrial Revolution was a purely good thing for society. And of course, many historians and writers in the 19th century castigated industrialization in some ways a negative development or factor in the human story. So I'm not seeking to say it was a good thing. What I am saying, though, is that in the late 1700s, a fundamental turning point happened. It began in Britain, it spread around the world, and that's why I say the Industrial Revolution was perhaps the most fundamental turning point in human history, because it broke that cycle of poverty, that recurring tendency for subsistence wages to prevail, which has unleashed the modern prosperity and opportunities and extended life expectancy, and so many benefits we enjoy at the world today. It was that turning point that occurred beginning in Britain in the late 1700s, and its echoes and repercussions are still observable in the world today. Thank you.